In the summer of 1947, 12-year-old Lena Hollister left a small tavern on the edge of Casper, her canvas bag hugged close to her body as she crossed the dirt road that led toward the Union Pacific Depot. Just minutes later, the last people who saw her said Lena was still walking under the fading sunset. Then she vanished. No cry for help, no signs of a struggle, no one saw her leave that road. Police searched for weeks, but found no body, no direct evidence, no answer. The small town whispered that the girl had run after her mother, or been snatched by a stranger among the old train cars. Lena's family lived for decades with the torment. Someone had erased her from the world in just a few steps, and no one had found the answer. More than half a century later, a land clearing project around Muddy Mountain accidentally turned up a small bone fragment. The survey team dug deeper and uncovered more remains that had lain silent beneath 60 years of dry, cold earth. Among them was a tiny metal hair clip, the kind Lena always wore. Forensic labs later found genetic traces linked to the Hollister bloodline, but it was a scrap of light brown fabric still clinging to the damp soil that shifted the entire investigation. The weave pattern exactly matched a piece of cloth found near the depot in 1947. Only one person at that time wore a uniform containing that exact fabric. Someone who worked at the depot, who pulled the night shift, who later vanished from Casper without explanation. Someone who knew exactly which way to take Lena, where to put her so no one would ever think to look. Someone who believed 70 years was long enough for the truth to stay buried forever. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to find long-forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Night in Casper, Wyoming draped a familiar stillness over the little neighborhood pressed up against the old Union Pacific rail yard. Wind blew through the silent rows of freight cars carrying the smell of coal dust and cold metal that defined the area. Not far away, the yellow lights of the North Platte Tavern still flickered, the place where railroad workers stopped for a drink after their shift before heading home. Lena Hollister, the 12-year-old girl everyone around here knew by sight, had been allowed to come out that evening because her mother was stopping by the tavern to meet a friend. Lena usually waited outside, leaning against the old wooden railing, watching people come and go. The neighborhood was quiet, everybody knew everybody. While the adults talked inside, a few patrons remembered seeing Lena leave before it got fully dark. She walked along the dirt road that ran parallel to the depot fence, her steps slow, as if she were looking for something familiar amid the distant sound of a train whistle. No one worried. Kids in Casper often wandered near the rail yard, and Lena knew the area well. But after that, no one saw her again. When Lena's mother stepped out of the tavern, the road in front was empty. She called her daughter's name, walked around the small parking lot, even checked behind the tavern, but there was no sign of Lena. Thinking the girl might have run to a nearby friend's house, she hurried door to door, but everyone shook their heads. A tight feeling of dread began to close around her. It was fully dark now, and Lena had never stayed out this long on her own. Neighbors started helping with the search. They walked along the depot fence, crossed the grassy lots toward the tracks, calling Lena's name into the wind that whipped around the abandoned cars. Even though they were only covering a small area, the search grew more tense by the minute, as the adults realized no one could remember exactly where they had last seen the girl. After nearly an hour with no results, fear crossed the line into panic. Lena's mother, trembling, went back to the nearest neighbor's house and asked them to call the Casper police. Officer Raymond Cole, a middle-aged man used to nuisance calls or fender benders, calmly picked up the receiver. But the moment the voice on the other end spoke, he sat bolt upright. It was a woman's voice, shaking, catching on every word. This wasn't the voice of someone with an ordinary problem, this was raw terror. The caller identified herself as a neighbor of the Hollister family, asked by Lena's mother to make the call because the mother was too distraught to speak to police herself. The neighbor tried to stay calm, but through the broken cadence, Officer Cole knew instantly this was a real emergency. He pulled his notepad closer, turned the desk lamp brighter, and began asking the standard questions for a missing juvenile report. Name of the victim, Lena Hollister, 12 years old. Last seen, right near the North Platte Tavern, sometime, we're not sure exactly. It was dark, and she still hadn't come home. Any history of running away or staying out? No, never. The neighbor paused as if to catch her breath. then added in a lower voice, "Her mom's been looking everywhere but can't find her. Nobody has. She only walked a short way, then just vanished." The phrase "then just vanished" made it impossible for Officer Cole to treat this lightly. He told the caller to keep everyone exactly where they were and stop spreading out so they wouldn't disturb any area. Lena might have passed through. The second he hung up, he put out an urgent call on the radio, sending the 2 closest patrol units to the scene immediately. From the sharp tone of his order, every other officer on duty knew this was not a normal lost child case. When police arrived, Lena's mother was standing in the middle of the road, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes red from crying. Another officer took down the same information Officer Cole had already recorded, and asked the gathering crowd to step back so they could establish the last known point, LKP, the exact spot where Lena was last seen. The LKP was quickly marked, the narrow dirt road between the tavern and the depot fence. From that point, the on-scene commander immediately moved to the next step in a missing child protocol, establishing the initial search perimeter. They set markers on a hand-drawn map, defining the area to be swept in the first hour: the dirt road, the grassy strips next to houses, the edge of the depot, and the entrances to the rail yard. Even with no clues yet, every witness account pointed in the general direction of the depot, making the rail yard the focus of the entire plan. Because of the complex terrain, the rail yard was partially sealed off while the search teams organized. They set up portable floodlights, handed out high-powered flashlights, and posted officers at the 3 main access points to log anyone coming or going. An old track ran along the fence, creating deep shadows, so the commander called in extra manpower to check every gap between the freight cars. Next came the most critical step: organizing a grid search. A small board was placed on the hood of a patrol car, and the commanding officer used chalk to mark out grid squares around the LKP like a fisherman's net. The first squares ran across the dirt road, then expanded toward the rail yard. Teams of 3 were assigned to each square, moving in straight, slow lines, shoulder to shoulder, so nothing would be missed. No one was allowed to touch anything they found. If something looked important, they marked it with a flashlight and called the evidence team. The top priority right now was finding Lena, or at least determining whether she was still inside the initial search area. The teams began sweeping, shining lights into low bushes, checking depressions in the ground, listening for any strange sound coming from the depot. Neighbors stood along the roadside holding their breath, but police kept asking them to stay back so they wouldn't contaminate the scene. In the first few hours, nothing stood out. No answering calls, nothing out of place. No sign Lena had left the main path, but the search teams didn't slow down. They kept expanding the grid south of the depot, where the rail yard opened into a dark, wide expanse, where a child could have wandered or been led. By the time the clock passed midnight, the entire initial area had been covered. There were no clear leads, but the police didn't let up. They started the second wider grid, pushing deeper into the rail yard and preparing to enter the most difficult section. No one knew that everything they did that night would become the opening chapter of a disappearance that would haunt Casper for more than half a century. As the second grid pushed deeper into the area, connecting the dirt road to the outer edge of the rail yard, one officer's flashlight suddenly stopped about 20 yards past the depot fence. The spot was between 2 large clumps of brush where the ground dipped slightly, an area easy to miss on the first sweep because of poor light. The officer crouched, aimed the beam more carefully, and immediately called his team leader over. Beneath grass that had clearly been pushed aside in a way that wasn't natural lay something unmistakable. When the team leader arrived, they all saw it, a small beige canvas bag, dusty but not torn. It wasn't something that could have randomly fallen from someone working in the depot. It matched perfectly the description Lena's mother had given of the bag her daughter always carried. The bag lay half exposed, half hidden, as if it had dropped while someone was hurrying or had snagged on something. Police immediately cordoned off a small square around it, placed markers and ordered everyone to stay several yards back. The discovery of the bag changed the entire mood. While the evidence team was called in, the officer in charge kept sweeping the surrounding area meter by meter. Just minutes later they found the second detail, a series of faint child-sized footprints in the soft dirt. The prints were small, shallow, and headed deeper into the rail yard. They were reasonably well preserved because the area saw little traffic and the night wind hadn't disturbed the soil much. A quick look was enough for the investigators to suspect these could be Lena's, but they didn't touch them, only marked the spot and waited for technicians to photograph and measure. A few yards farther south, between two old tire ruts in slightly muddy ground, another officer called out. Adult boot prints stood out much more clearly than the child's. They were significantly larger, longer strided, and most importantly, they ran in exactly the same direction as the smaller prints, as if the adult had been walking behind or right alongside Lena. The whole team went on high alert. They left the boot prints untouched, simply circling them with reflective tape so no one would step on them. The combination of the canvas bag, child footprints, and adult boot prints formed the first traceable chain, but it was the fourth clue that really stopped everyone in their tracks. When an officer knelt to examine the pushed-aside grass beside the dirt path, his light caught a single small brown thread snagged on a dry stalk. It was thin, slightly twisted, not a bright color or soft fabric. It was the coarse thick thread used in work jackets or industrial cloth. Though tiny, it lay exactly where the child and adult tracks overlapped, so police immediately flagged it for preservation. At this point the entire team understood this was no longer a simple search. The scattered pieces of evidence were forming a clear directional trail. Lena had left the area near the tavern, walked toward the depot, leaving footprints. An adult had followed, or walked in the same direction. Lena's bag had fallen along the way. A brown thread was caught at the spot where the tracks mixed. The team leader ordered everyone to keep the grid intact, but switch from a broad sweep to a tracking path model. Instead of covering every square evenly, they now followed the logical sequence of evidence: bag, child prints, adult prints, thread. That path led straight toward the left side of the depot, where a route entered the outer rail yard, a wide, complicated area full of hiding places. Every subsequent meter of ground was examined under flashlight beams. No one spoke aloud, but everyone knew they had found the route Lena had taken before she disappeared. The focus narrowed to every breath, every step, because the first pieces of evidence had finally appeared, and they carried the single most important thing in a missing person investigation direction. Even without understanding the full meaning of each mark, the officers felt they were standing on the edge of a story that would stretch far beyond anything they had imagined. And every trail right now led into the rail yard, an area that was both the heart of the town's activity and a place that could swallow all traces of a child lost in the dark. The traces found on the open lot led the entire search team's eyes straight toward the opening into the rail yard, where secondary tracks branched out like a spider web and old freight cars lay scattered in the darkness. From the position of the last piece of evidence, police temporarily reconstructed the likely path. The adult and the child had walked along the narrow dirt corridor between the fence and the row of empty cars before moving deeper into the depot area that streetlights couldn't reach. Realizing this was most likely the final stretch of Lena's journey, the field commander halted the entire grid search force behind them and ordered the whole team to advance into the rail yard in a single file line, focusing on one cluster of freight cars at a time. The moment they stepped inside, they immediately felt the difference. The ground was no longer flat, but turned into gravel mixed with rust flakes, a surface far more likely to retain marks if something was dragged or dropped. Flashlights swept through patches of darkness, scanning along iron wheels, the walls of old cars and the ground between the spur tracks. It didn't take long for the first clue to appear. At the foot of an abandoned wooden freight car, cigarette ash formed into a small pile, compacted as if it had just been hurriedly stubbed out. The team leader crouched down, shone his light closer, and asked the on-site forensic officer to examine the ash. When lifted and inspected under the beam, the distinctive smell and color allowed a quick identification. It was ash from a Lucky Strike, a brand common among rail yard workers at the time, but the ash was located exactly where someone would stand to observe, as if a person had paused, smoked quickly, then moved on. Deeper between the freight cars, another officer aimed his light at the steps leading up to a wooden car and discovered the second clue, a long skid mark on the wooden surface, running from the edge of the car door down to the gravel. The mark wasn't from cargo falling out, it was narrow, shallow, like the imprint of something light being dragged or sliding diagonally. The length of the mark indicated a downward pulling force, very likely tied directly to an adult's movement in the area. This immediately prompted police to flag that car for deeper inspection. The forensics team climbed inside the wooden car, shining lights over thick dust and rotting planks. Near the left corner, beneath an old pallet, they found something very small but critical, a brown fabric fiber identical to the type discovered earlier on the vacant lot. Though only a few millimeters long, the weave pattern and color matched perfectly, proving the person carrying that fabric had been both outside and inside the rail yard. Under the flashlight, it became the backbone connecting the rail yard to the path Lena had taken, a single thread stretching the story from the evidence on the lot all the way inside the train car. When the entire group regrouped, the field commander ordered them to reconstruct the final movements inside the depot. The cigarette ash located at an observation point near the entrance, the skid mark on the freight car trembling as if ending a sudden motion, the fabric fiber inside the car, proving the perpetrator had entered or made direct contact with the car's surfaces. From these three elements, police sketched a movement pattern. The perpetrator entered via the narrow passage next to the fence, paused to watch near the wooden car, then either climbed onto the freight car, or pulled something down from it. Although they couldn't yet determine exactly what happened inside, the chain of clues was enough to show the rail yard wasn't merely a place Lena passed through. It was likely where the final act occurred before she vanished. That night, amid the darkness of the old freight cars, police knew they had just stepped into a completely different phase of the search, a place where human traces were clearer, where the perpetrator's final movements began to reveal themselves layer by layer under the lot. From that moment on, every line of investigation would originate from that cold, desolate rail yard. From the new clues collected in the rail yard, police paid special attention to information several residents near the neighborhood had mentioned the very night Lena disappeared. A brown panel truck that had been lingering near the depot shortly before the girl was last seen. In 1947, Casper, that type of vehicle was far less common than sedans or pickups, making it stand out among the usual traffic around the rail area. After quickly verifying with several witnesses living near the road into the rail yard, police agreed the brown panel truck was the rare vehicle multiple people had noticed during the same time window. The next morning, the Casper Police Department formed a dedicated team focused entirely on investigating the suspect vehicle. Their first task was to compile a complete list of owners of brown panel trucks within the city and surrounding residential area. In 1947, vehicle registration records were still largely manual, with many documents kept at City Hall and the county office, forcing officers to visit each location in person to copy lists of owners by color and model. Panel trucks were typically used as delivery vans, repairmen's vehicles, or tool transports. So while the total number registered wasn't large, they were scattered all over Casper. The initial list contained more than a dozen vehicles matching the description, mostly Ford and Chevrolet models produced between 1937 and 1946. The investigation team split into smaller groups, each assigned to contact an owner, verify the vehicle, and ask about its whereabouts on the day Lena disappeared. Some owners cooperated immediately, providing information that their truck had stayed in the garage all day or proving they had left Casper during a different time period. Those cases were marked for rechecking, but temporarily treated as having alibi. Another group was given the harder task, interviewing owners who weren't home when police arrived, or people who habitually parked in industrial areas where it was difficult to confirm whether they had been near the depot during the critical window. They also requested confirmation from family members, co-workers or employers to verify whether the owner had been somewhere else when Lena vanished. Every piece of information was carefully recorded in reports for later cross-checking. As the list gradually narrowed, police identified several cases worth noting. One owner insisted his truck had stayed home all afternoon, yet neighbors said they saw it moving. Another owner claimed he was repairing his truck in a shop while several workers reported seeing his brown panel truck leave the shop around the suspect time. However, these signs weren't yet strong enough to be considered suspicious, since mistaken recollections of time were common. Still, police kept those cases in the group requiring closer scrutiny. By the end of the day, several names had been completely eliminated thanks to solid alibi. One person had been in Cheyenne all day, two others were working distant shifts at mines north of Casper. Another owner had been in a minor accident that morning, and his truck was in the garage for repairs. These eliminations steadily narrowed the field, reducing the number of suspects from more than 10 to just a handful who couldn't prove where they were when Lena disappeared. In the day's final compiled reports, the vehicle investigation team realized one thing. The brown panel truck mentioned by multiple witnesses couldn't possibly be a coincidence, especially since statements from some residents near the wooden paved road beside the depot described the truck driving slowly, as if looking for a turn or watching the area. Though they still couldn't identify the driver, police understood this vehicle might be the crucial link in the route Lena had taken. When the suspect list was narrowed to 3 owners without solid alibis, police planned deeper investigations of each individual in the coming day. Although they couldn't yet confirm this was the vehicle directly involved in the disappearance, every indicator pointed to it being present at the right time in the right place, and distinctive enough that it could not be ignored. The brown panel truck, silent among countless ordinary vehicles in Casper, suddenly became the focal point, possibly the only bridge connecting Lena Hollister's disappearance to the person who took her away from the neighborhood on that fateful night. Once the screening of the suspect vehicle had significantly narrowed the list, police returned to the critical step, cross-referencing every witness statement to piece together the most accurate possible timeline of Lena's disappearance. Starting early that morning, officers were dispatched back to every location in the area, from the front of the North Platte Tavern, along the dirt road leading toward the depot, to the houses along the main road where residents might have observed any unusual movement. Near the tavern, statements from people present that evening were collected more thoroughly than the first time. One of the key witnesses was a middle-aged woman living across from the bar, who had seen Lena leave the tavern and walk slowly along the dirt road. She didn't see anyone with her, but she remembered that right after Lena moved out of sight, she briefly glimpsed the figure of a man standing at the corner, taller than average, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, looking toward the depot. At the time she thought he was just a rail worker on break, but after Lena went missing, that memory became far more significant. On the main road near the residential area, police located another witness, a man repairing his fence at dusk. He recalled a strange man walking past his house in a hurry, holding a half-smoked cigarette in his left hand. This detail was immediately flagged because an officer had previously noted that the cigarette ash recovered in the rail yard was Lucky Strike, and the stranger the witness saw held the cigarette in his left hand, a characteristic not everyone would notice, unless watching close. Another witness, the owner of a small store near the turn toward the depot, confirmed he had seen a man standing near the rail yard entrance about half an hour before the family realized Lena was gone. The man stood in one spot for quite a while, as if waiting or watching the area. When asked to describe him, the store owner said the man had dark hair, unremarkable clothes, but his posture radiated caution. More importantly, when the man finally left, he walked deeper into the narrow passage beside the depot, the same direction Lena was believed to have taken early. After compiling the statements, police realized something crucial. Every separate account intersected at clear points. A strange man appeared around the area Lena was moving through. His direction of movement consistently matched the direction Lena took toward the depot. Multiple people noted he was left-handed or held objects in his left hand, details that aligned with findings from the rail yard clues. The skid mark and observation points leaned more to the left side. To reconstruct the timeline, police relied on 3 main sources: the statements, the witnesses' vantage points, and the onset of darkness. They created a map plotting where each witness saw either Lena or the strange man. From that, the following timeline emerged. Time 1. Lena leaves the tavern and heads down the dirt road. Time 2. The woman across the street sees Lena walking away and simultaneously spots the man's silhouette near the corner. Time 3. The man repairing the fence sees the man walk past his house, cigarette in his left hand. Time 4. The store owner near the depot sees the man standing near the rail yard entrance during the window when Lena disappeared. What especially struck police was that the directions of movement in the statements practically connected into one straight, unbroken line leading to the depot. No one saw Lena head back toward home, no statement placed her in any other direction, and every description of the strange man tied to that same route. When the timeline reconstruction was completed in the temporary meeting room set up near the scene, police for the first time had a clear picture of the sequence of events. They couldn't pinpoint the exact minute Lena vanished, but the chain of statements built a tight time frame. The little girl walked alone toward the depot, and a strange man was moving in the same direction, appearing both before and after the points she passed. This timeline didn't solve the entire mystery, but it made one thing clear: Lena's disappearance was not random. It was tied to the presence of a man no one in the area recognized, a man whose characteristics were starting to match the evidence left in the rail yard. From here the investigation moved to a new phase, finding the left-handed man who had appeared along Lena Hollister's final route. Although the newly constructed timeline showed a significant overlap between Lena's movements and those of the strange man, the moment the investigation team tried to take even one step further, they immediately hit barriers that night. The clearest lead at the time was the brown panel truck mentioned by multiple witnesses, but every attempt to trace the vehicle was blocked at the most critical detail. No one had seen the license plate. Witnesses only remembered the color, the body style, and the silhouette of a man getting in or standing beside it, but no one was close enough or had enough light to read the numbers on the metal plate at the rear. No plate meant dozens of identical model and color trucks in Casper would forever remain in the possible column, and not a single owner could be definitively ruled out, except for a handful with ironclad alibis. It wasn't just the truck. Not a single witness could clearly describe the strange man's face. Every recollection was vague: a tall figure, wide-brimmed hat, slightly hurried gait, hunched posture, or a cigarette held in the left hand. Those details, though consistent, were far too generic to identify anyone. No one saw him speak to Lena, no one saw him touch the girl, and no one witnessed any direct action that could be considered criminal evidence. The entire witness file was nothing more than a string of disconnected observations, suspicious suggestions, but never strong enough to reach a conclusion. No body, no clear suspect, and no undeniable physical evidence. The investigation began sliding into a dead end where every path branched into ambiguity. Any inference, no matter how reasonable, rested on unprovable assumptions. For example, the skid mark inside the freight car was that the perpetrators, or just an old trace. The Lucky Strike cigarette ash was that from the strange man or from any depot worker who stubbed one out before his shift. The brown fabric fiber, was it from the clothes of whoever took Lena, or just a scrap from a railroad worker's uniform? In the modern era, those questions could be answered with DNA testing, trace particle analysis, or digital crime scene reconstruction. But in 1947, forensic science had virtually no tools to distinguish one individual's fabric fiber from anyone else's, or to determine when an item of evidence had fallen to the ground. Footprints and shoe prints, even when fully documented, were only supporting information, never prosecutable proof. Police were forced to confront a bitter truth: they were dealing with a missing person case in which every clue mattered, yet no clue carried enough weight to open a new investigative direction. Daily briefings began repeating the same lines: no new development, no additional witnesses who saw the face clearly, unable to narrow the list of brown panel truck owners, no trace of Lena found within the search radius. Days turned into weeks. The initial hope of the family and community slowly faded. Lena's disappearance unsettled the entire town of Casper, but unease alone could not manufacture evidence. With each passing day, the chance of finding Lena alive dwindled, and police knew they had reached the insurmountable limit of an investigation that depended almost entirely on human eyesight. Finally, after weeks of fruitless searching, the Casper Police Department was forced to make the announcement no one wanted to hear. The Lena Hollister missing person file was moved from active to inactive. That did not mean the case was forgotten, but it marked the point where investigators no longer had sufficient data to pursue any new leads. Disappointment spread through the briefing room when the decision was announced. Some officers still believed the key was hidden somewhere in the rail yard or in someone's hazy statement, but the law did not allow arrests based on hunches, and reality did not permit endless investigation of a path with no exit. The final reports from this phase contained one concise, heartbreaking line: insufficient evidence to continue investigation. Case suspended. Casper remained haunted by the question, where did Lena go on that dark night? And that question would remain unanswered for decades to come. More than 2 decades after the Lena Hollister file was moved to inactive, the long silence surrounding the disappearance began to trouble a new generation of investigators. In the early 1970s, the Casper Police Department conducted a cold case review of unsolved files from the 1940s and 1950s, and Lena's case quickly rose to the top because of its severity and the fact it happened in the middle of a residential area. A young detective recently transferred from Cheyenne spent hours rereading the entire file and was the one who proposed reopening it, arguing that forensic techniques were now light years ahead of. The proposal was approved, and the case was officially reactivated after nearly 25 years. Evidence once considered indistinguishable was placed back on the lab table under examination lights. The brown fabric fiber, adult shoe prints, taken from damp soil, cigarette ash, left near the wooden freight car. Everything was re-examined using the new forensic methods then being adopted by American police departments. The first item the team tackled was the brown fabric fiber. In 1947, officers could only look at it with the naked eye and guess based on its coarse texture, but by the 1970s, polarizing microscopes and fiber dye testing made it possible to clearly distinguish weave type, twist direction, material composition, and even the industrial dye used. When the brown fiber was placed under the scope, the forensic examiner quickly realized something. This was not outdoor clothing fabric or common civilian cloth. It was the type used in work uniforms, especially those common in the Western railroad industry. Coarse weave, high durability, wool-cotton blend for abrasion resistance, all specifications required by Union Pacific for jackets and work pants. This discovery not only confirmed the fiber belonged to an adult present at the rail yard, it strongly suggested that person was directly connected to railroad work, a repairman, freight car worker, or someone with regular access to the depot. That opened an entirely new investigative avenue, because the suspect pool could now be dramatically narrowed by occupation rather than broad guessing. At the same time, another team reclassified the shoe prints recovered from the soft ground. By the 1970s, police were using standardized tread pattern comparison systems that could distinguish shoe models by groove shape, depth, and layout. Analysis showed the prints belonged to rubber-soled work boots, typically worn with Union labor uniform. The distinctive narrow V-shaped tread pattern further reinforced the theory that the man seen near the rail yard was not an outsider but very likely worked right there. The final piece of evidence re-examined was the cigarette ash. In 1947, police could only identify the brand from remaining paper, but by the 1970s, tobacco companies kept detailed production and distribution records by state. Using the ash sample and a partial filter, technicians identified it as Lucky Strike from a batch distributed exclusively within Wyoming. From the batch number they obtained a list of Casper stores that sold that specific run at the time Lena disappeared. The list wasn't enough to identify the smoker, but it told investigators the man in the rail yard was far more likely a local resident or frequent visitor. When the three forensic results were combined, a new picture began to emerge. Brown fiber, railroad worker uniform, shoe prints, distinctive work boots consistent with railroad industry, cigarette ash, Lucky Strike batch sold in Casper, matching the smoking habits common among railroad employees of the era. These findings were not direct evidence pointing to a specific perpetrator, but they provided a far stronger foundation than anything available in. Instead of investigating the entire population, the team could now focus on personnel who worked at or regularly visited the rail yard, especially anyone who suddenly changed jobs or left Casper shortly after Lena vanished. At the summary meeting, the lead detective concluded that although many links were still missing, the new analyses had at last given them a concrete direction rather than vague speculation. And from that direction, one name would gradually rise to the surface in the next chapters of a case that has now spanned more than a century. The 1970s, forensic analysis, created a solid enough foundation for investigators to finally piece together the fragments collected in 1947, allowing them for the first time to construct a systematic profile of the person likely involved in Lena Hollister's disappearance. No longer scattered guesses, all the data was brought back to the table and analyzed using elimination methods combined with behavioral inference, a fresh approach at the time. The traces on the ground leading into the rail yard showed the presence of two people, a small child, and an adult. The shoe prints were large, with a tread pattern characteristic of work boots, and the strides were even and powerful, suggesting a man accustomed to walking on the rough industrial terrain. The way the soil was compressed also indicated significant body weight, ruling out a teenager or casual passerby. Inside the rail yard, the location of the cigarette ash and the skid mark on the freight car floor revealed a distinctive trait. Nearly all the traces were biased to the left side. The spot where the cigarette was stubbed out, The way the ash fell, the angled skid on the wooden surface, everything combined pointed to the natural movements of a left-handed person. When investigators noted this, it immediately stood out because left-handedness is far less common in the population. Nearby witnesses had also recalled the strange man holding his cigarette in his left hand, matching the rail yard analysis perfectly. The cigarette was confirmed as Lucky Strike from the Casper area batch. That didn't identify the smoker, but it showed the man had the exact smoking habit common among railroad workers. When combined with the reanalyzed brown fiber, confirmed as the type used in rail yard work uniforms, the overall picture sharpened. This man was not a stranger from out of town, he very likely worked at the depot itself, or at least frequented it. Witness statements around the tavern, dirt roads and rail yard entrance also shed light on the timeline. Though no one saw the man's face, many confirmed he appeared at multiple locations, always along the same line of movement that led straight to the depot. No one saw him leave the area in another direction, and no one described him speaking to or approaching anyone else. He was simply a silent presence, watching and moving along the same axis Lena had traveled. Putting all these elements together, investigators identified 5 core characteristics for the initial behavioral profile. Left-handed, shown by the way he smoked, his stance, and the skid mark. Directly connected to the rail yard, evidenced by the uniform fiber, work boots, and ease of movement inside the depot. Smoked Lucky Strike, matching the recovered ash, had access to a brown panel truck, based on consistent witness descriptions of the vehicle around the depot. Present at the depot at the exact time Lena vanished, based on the chain of matching witness sightings of his movements. With these criteria, the 1970s investigators began reviewing all Union Pacific Depot personnel records from 1947, a task their predecessors had attempted but lacked the tools to assess deeply. They looked for workers or staff who matched the 5-point list they had just built. The initial list contained dozens of names, but when the criteria were applied, it narrowed quickly. Anyone not left-handed was eliminated. Anyone not working at the rail yard at the time was crossed off. Anyone who didn't live nearby or had a clear residence record on the day Lena disappeared was removed. And then one name began to stand out far more clearly than the rest. Clifford Hale. In the archived records, Hale was listed as a freight car repairman who was frequently at the depot outside regular hours due to the nature of his job. He was left-handed, smoked Lucky Strike, and owned an older truck that matched witness description. Most notably, work schedules and payroll records showed Clifford was in Casper at the exact time of the disappearance. Yet he left town not long afterward for an undisclosed location with no recorded reason. There was no direct evidence to charge him, but for the first time in decades, every trace in the case seemed to converge on one individual. From scattered clues, the name Clifford Hale emerged like a shadow standing in that rail yard, and from here, the investigation moved into an entirely new phase. Once the name Clifford Hale surfaced from the depot personnel list, the investigation team immediately shifted focus to re-verifying his complete work schedule and residency records in Casper at the time Lena Hollister disappeared. If Clifford's presence in the town during that exact period could not be confirmed, all previous inferences would remain mere hypotheses. But if the timelines matched, his file would instantly become the centerpiece of the entire reopened investigation. Retrieving records from the 1940s was far from easy. Many documents were faded, ink-blotted or stored in scattered metal cabinets at the old Union Pacific Depot. Yet after days of combing through every file, investigators located Clifford's employment and time card record. The most critical information appeared in the shift assignment notes. Clifford Hale was present in Casper throughout the summer of 1947, the exact period when Lena vanished. Multiple consecutive workdays were logged, showing he worked full-time in the freight car repair department, a job that required near-constant presence inside the depot. Moreover, the records revealed that Clifford frequently worked overtime in the evenings or stayed at the depot after regular hours. This aligned perfectly with the behavioral analysis that the perpetrator could move around the depot without drawing attention, a trait typically true only of internal staff. The investigators flagged this detail as highly significant, as it directly linked Clifford's presence in the depot to the time Lena entered the area. Next, the team moved on to screening residency record. According to the town's archive office, Clifford at the time rented a room on the eastern outskirts of Casper, not far from the rail yard. Previous and subsequent tenants were interviewed, but after so many decades most could only vaguely recall that Clifford was quiet, left early and came back late, or rarely spoke to neighbors. Though they offered no specific details, nearly all agreed he lived in Casper in the months immediately before and after the disappearance. Another residency record found in the county tax archives showed Clifford paid local taxes in the spring of 1947, confirming he had a valid address in town. What drew even more attention, however, was the absence of any tax records for Clifford in Casper. His disappearance from the tax rolls was flagged as unusual, since most long-term rail yard workers did not abruptly relocate without personal reasons or a job transfer. From there the investigation turned special attention to Clifford's vehicle record. Although they were not specifically looking for the brown panel truck, they still needed to confirm whether he owned any vehicle during that period. In the Natrona County Archives, a vehicle registration fee receipt showed Clifford had registered an older enclosed box truck, a type commonly used by workers to haul tools. Its recorded color was wood brown, but the registration predated the disappearance, so it was not an exact match. Nevertheless, Clifford's ownership of a discrete enclosed vehicle that fit the behavioral profile elevated him further on the suspect list. The final piece that made Clifford the central focus of the investigation was the fact that he left Casper immediately after Lena vanished. In the depot timecard file, his name abruptly stopped after a late shift in the same month as the disappearance. There was no resignation note, no transfer request, and no explanatory record. A co-worker interviewed in the 1970s recalled only that Clifford vanished from town unusually fast, without saying goodbye or handing over his duty. The chain of data, work schedule, residency records, and sudden departure interlocked to transform Clifford Hale from a name that had merely surfaced through speculation into the first suspect who satisfied every temporal, geographic, and behavioral condition. There was no direct evidence to charge him, but for the police the web of connections was now too clear for Clifford to be overlooked again. And from this point, the Lena Hollister case began shifting from vague assumptions to a concrete investigative target. Once investigators had verified Clifford Hale's work schedule and residency, they moved to the most critical phase of the cold case review, systematically comparing every established offender characteristic against Clifford's personal file to determine the degree of match. If previously he had been just a standout name on the depot employee list, this methodical cross-matching would now reveal whether he truly fit the perpetrator's profile. The behavioral characteristics built during analysis, drawn from physical evidence, witness statements, crime scene analysis, and forensic reasoning, were listed item by item. Each was directly compared against verified data from Clifford's records and biography. The first striking match was left-handedness. This detail appeared in the depot's medical personnel file. Clifford was recorded as left-handed when signing safety forms, an uncommonly documented trait among rail yard workers of that era. The second characteristic, clear, direct connection to the rail yard, was virtually indisputable. Clifford worked in freight car repair and was routinely present in the depot, including after hours. The job required regular access to the exact type of old rail cars where evidence was later found. Overall, no other name from the old employee list matched as deeply. The brown fabric fibers, work boot type, and smoking habit all belonged to the daily environment Clifford inhabited. The third characteristic, habit of smoking Lucky Strike, was also documented. An old co-worker interviewed during the reopened investigation remembered Clifford often bumming cigarettes, and Lucky Strike was the most common brand in the depot at the time. The detail did not prove guilt, but it matched the cigarette ash found at the scene, and the brand used by most rail yard workers. The fourth characteristic, access to a panel truck type vehicle, was assessed using old registration documents. Although Clifford's registered truck did not perfectly match the witness description, its style and color came closest among the scant sightings from the night Lena disappeared. Many people owned similar vehicles, but after reviewing timelines, only Clifford lacked a clear alibi for that time window. The fifth characteristic, presence near the depot at the time of Lena's disappearance, became the final connecting point. Work schedules, sign-in logs, and depot notes all proved Clifford was there throughout the critical period. More importantly, shortly afterward, he abruptly left Casper without following proper resignation procedures. That sudden departure was not direct proof, but it reinforced suspicion, as rail yard workers rarely quit mid-paycheck without notice. When Clifford was compared to everyone else on the expanded suspect list, the difference was stark. Others either were not left-handed, had work records proving they were nowhere near the depot, or possessed clear residency records for the exact time of the disappearance. Some had alibis from coworkers, others had left town months earlier. After cross-checking every case, an original list of more than a dozen names was reduced to exactly one individual who could not be eliminated: Clifford Hale. When the investigators gathered to summarize, they laid out the documents, comparison charts, and Clifford's file side by side. Though no direct prosecutable evidence existed from 1947, every behavioral characteristic of the perpetrator pointed in the same direction. It was not that Clifford possessed one standout trait, it was that he consistently matched the entire chain while no one else matched more than two. The official suspect profile was finalized: name Clifford Hale, occupation freight car repair worker, Union Pacific Depot, dominant hand, left cigarette brand, Lucky Strike. Residence, near the depot, Casper. Presence timeline, entire window of Lena's disappearance. Residency history, left Casper shortly after the incident. Access to enclosed panel truck type vehicle. In the briefing room, no one voiced aloud what everyone was thinking, but the conclusion was written in sharp ink on the file. Clifford Hale is the only suspect who fully satisfies every behavioral characteristic of the perpetrator in the Lena Hollister disappearance. For the first time in over 2 decades, the case no longer rested on thin clues. It had a focal point, it had a name, and from here, the investigation pivoted entirely toward illuminating that one individual. With the suspect profile now narrowed to essentially only Clifford Hale, 1970s investigators still faced a harsh reality. Every argument rested on behavior, characteristic matches, and context. No direct physical evidence existed that could bring Clifford to trial. The file was shelved again for decades, until forensic science entered a completely new era. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA analysis prompted law enforcement across the country to revisit old cases, especially disappearances without a body like Lena Hollister's. However, the technology at the time still could not reliably process extremely small, old, or degraded samples. Attempts to test Lena's cloth bag were therefore considered high risk with low odds of success. Only in the late 2010s, when ultra-trace DNA extraction techniques were announced and widely implemented, was the Lena Hollister case officially moved to the retestable category. Lena's cloth bag, the first piece of evidence recovered in 1947, long thought too old to yield any useful biological trace, was sent to a laboratory specializing in historical samples. The extraction process lasted weeks. The fabric was handled in a sterile clean room, with tiny sections sampled using micro-optical techniques. No one dared hope too much, but a miracle occurred. A minute amount of DNA was recovered from the bag's hem where the threads twisted together. The sample was incomplete and fragmented by time, but sufficient to generate a partial profile usable for genetic genealogy comparison. This was the moment that changed everything. The partial DNA could not be run through traditional criminal databases due to insufficient markers, but it was perfect for uploading to genealogical DNA platforms where millions of Americans had voluntarily submitted their genetic data to find distant relatives. The lab uploaded the data to investigative platforms, and the algorithms began searching for individuals sharing segments of genetic material with the DNA from Lena's bag. More than a month later, results came back. Among distant matches, a small cluster stood out with shared ancestry. When analysts began building the family trees of that cluster, multiple branches converged on one surname, Hale. Not every Hale was connected to the crime, but the genealogical DNA made one thing clear: the perpetrator belonged to the Hale lineage, or had direct blood ties to that family. This immediately linked back to decades-old investigative data. Of all potential suspects from 1947 who worked at the depot, only one carried the surname Hale: Clifford Hale. For verification, the genealogy team constructed multi-generational family trees using records from Hale branches in the Wyoming area. They identified roughly 5 to 6 Hale men living in or near Casper during the 1940s. But when age, occupation, residency history, and civil records were cross-checked, only one individual met every single condition required to be Lena's abductor: Clifford Hale, living in Casper at the exact time, employed at the depot, left-handed, and gone from town immediately after the incident. No other name matched both the DNA pattern and the behavioral profile. The Casper Police Department forwarded all data to the State Investigative Unit and held an internal brief. During that meeting, a veteran detective said the words recorded verbatim in the minutes. "We lost Lena in 1947 because we had no DNA. After decades, technology has finally given her the one voice she could never speak herself, who touched her back." No one treated the DNA as conclusive proof of guilt at this stage, but it created something that had been impossible for nearly 80 years. A scientific link to a real person. And when every piece was placed together, behavior, timeline, occupation, residency history, left-handedness, smoking habit, and now genealogical DNA. Clifford Hale was no longer just a suspect. He became the sole individual every investigative thread pointed to. The search for the perpetrator in the Lena Hollister disappearance, after nearly 8 decades, had finally reached an irreversible turning point. After the genealogical DNA results narrowed the suspect pool to the Hale family, and Clifford emerged as the most prominent name, the investigation team's next step was to reconstruct his complete movement history from 1947 onward, across multiple decades. If Clifford's travel route matched the paths and timelines the perpetrator could have used in the Lena Hollister case, it would serve as the next critical layer of confirmation, a kind of movement profile that directly linked the individual to the crime scene context. First, the investigators returned to old documents that had previously been partially reviewed, but this time they approached them with a completely different logic, stringing everything together chronologically instead of analyzing fragments in isolation. In the Union Pacific Depot archives, payroll records from 1947-1948 showed Clifford working regularly in Casper until late autumn 1947. Then his time card entries abruptly stopped, with no notation that he had been fired or formally resigned. This was treated as the first confirmed timestamp of his departure from Casper. To determine where he went next, investigators checked rental records stored in the county finance office. In Casper, records showed Clifford had been renting a room month to month starting early, but in early 1948, the lease renewal line was crossed out in period ink with a handwritten note, "Moved out, no forwarding address." This confirmed a second marker. Clifford had not only left his job, but also terminated his residence in the town. To keep tracking him, the team expanded their search to tax records in neighboring Wyoming counties, since intertown moves in that era rarely generated formal paperwork. In Fremont County they located a 1949 tax bill in the name of Clifford Hale. The address listed was a small residential area near Riverton, more than 120 kilometers west of Casper. This was the first evidence that Clifford had resettled, at least briefly, after leaving Casper. When the map was consulted, the investigators immediately noticed something striking. The route from Casper to Riverton passed directly through sparsely populated areas and terrain that allowed travel without drawing attention, exactly matching the 1947 analyses of the likely escape routes the perpetrator used to leave Casper after the disappearance. The next document that extended the movement chain was vehicle registration records. A 1950 entry showed Clifford registering an older pickup truck in Fremont County. The vehicle description did not perfectly match the panel truck seen in 1947, but the key point was this: Clifford continued to use an enclosed cargo vehicle suitable for quiet mobile movement, the exact type the perpetrator most likely owned. This reinforced the picture of consistency in his habits, from employment and housing to choice of transportation. As the team continued combing records from subsequent years, Clifford's movement pattern became clearer. In 1953 he appeared on a temporary employee roster for a machinery repair company in Rock Springs. By the late 1950s, his name showed up again in Carbon County tax records. Although no criminal incidents or unusual events were noted during these years, what stood out was that Clifford repeatedly left, settled briefly, and left again, creating a scattered yet steady pattern, never staying anywhere too long, and frequently appearing near towns with depots or transportation hubs. From this the investigators built a decades-long movement map for Clifford. When this map was overlaid with the likely 1947 escape route of the perpetrator, the matches became alarming. In particular, The direction Clifford took when leaving Casper in the months following the incident aligned with the direction the perpetrator vanished in when 1947 police lost the trail west of the city. It wasn't just geographical similarity. Clifford's habits always avoiding town centers, choosing small residential areas or locations near rail lines, matched the behavioral profile of someone trying to stay unnoticed after involvement in a serious disappearance. When the completed movement map was presented at an internal briefing, the investigators realized one thing. Not a single timestamp contradicted the assumptions built from the original. Every point in Clifford's timeline matched the occupational pattern tied to depots, short-term residency habits, movement along rail corridors, and the Casper exit route, believed to be the perpetrator's escape path. No other suspect had a movement history that aligned so seamlessly. The investigators concluded in their summary report, based on the entirety of archival data, Clifford Hale's movement history matches perfectly with the trajectory of the individual responsible for Lena Hollister's 1947 disappearance. No document contradicts this possibility. With the full-time space map now assembled, the case moved into the phase of direct confrontation with Clifford. Even though he was now elderly, living in seclusion, and believing his past had been buried forever. The perfect alignment of Clifford Hale's decades-long movement chain with the perpetrator's likely escape route in the Lena Hollister disappearance, created an irreversible turning point. Immediately after the historical map was submitted, federal investigators and Wyoming police entered the final preparation stage, obtaining an arrest warrant from the court based on the totality of behavioral evidence, archival data, and genealogical DNA results showing the perpetrator belonged to the Hale lineage, with Clifford being the only individual who met every criterion. The warrant was approved quietly, no press conference, no leak. The extreme sensitivity of a case spanning more than 70 years made the authorities determined to minimize any chance Clifford could flee his residence or destroy valuable documents. Once signed, a special task force consisting of county deputies, state police and 2 federal agents was deployed the same day. Clifford Hale was now an 89-year-old man, living alone in an old wooden house on the edge of Lander, Wyoming. The house sat back from the main road, screened by mature trees, a location few would notice without knowing the exact address. Early on the morning of the warrant execution, the task force approached in complete silence. No sirens, no lights. Everything was carried out using soft containment tactics, suited to an elderly suspect who might still react unpredictably. 2 officers knocked at the front door while the rest secured positions around the house. When Clifford opened the door, he showed no surprise. His eyes simply went blank for a moment, as if he instantly understood why they were there. The commanding officer read the arrest warrant. Clifford Hale stood motionless, offering no argument, asking no questions. He extended his hands before being asked, and the handcuffing took place in total silence. They walked him off the weathered wooden porch, where cracks in the boards ran like witnesses to a secret buried far too long. Neighbors began peeking out, confused about what was happening, because Clifford had always been quiet, kept to himself and never caused trouble. The few older residents vaguely recognized him as someone who once worked at a long-ago depot, but couldn't recall details. Word spread fast. Police were arresting a nearly 90-year-old man for something from. As the patrol car pulled away from town, the official Wyoming State Police press release went out. A suspect in the 1947 Lena Hollister disappearance, Casper, has been taken into custody. Suspect: Clifford Hale, age 89. That single sentence instantly triggered massive shock. Local stations ran continuous coverage, even national outlets jumped on the story, because the case was one of the oldest cold cases ever solved. No one in the Wyoming community had ever imagined that the Lena Hollister case, a little girl who vanished without a trace, nearly 80 years earlier, would one day return to the light of justice. Community reactions were mixed. Older residents remembered when Casper was still a railroad town, and the disappearance had kept every family on edge for months. Younger generations were stunned that a seemingly gentle old man had suddenly been arrested in connection with one of Wyoming's biggest historical mysteries. Discussions exploded. How could someone live an entire life without being caught? Why did it take nearly 80 years to arrest a suspect? Are there other secrets still buried with time? For the investigators, this was not the end, only the beginning of the final confrontation and analysis phase. but for the Wyoming community. The day Clifford Hale was led in handcuffs off his weathered porch marked a historic moment. A cold case that had spanned nearly an entire century had officially been revived, and it would shake every remaining memory of an era everyone thought had been forgotten forever. Immediately after Clifford Hale was brought to Wyoming State Police headquarters, the first interrogation began almost at once. Despite being nearly 90, Clifford remained alert, sitting upright with both hands resting on the cold metal table. When the investigator opened by informing him of the reason for his arrest, Clifford slowly shook his head and said he had never been involved in any disappearance in his life. That calm denial, no trembling, caused the session to run longer than planned. The investigator showed him a summary of the criminal grounds: his presence at the depot in 1947, handedness, the suspicious departure from Casper, and the genealogical DNA data. Clifford responded with the same line, "I don't know what you're talking about." When asked about his depot job in 1947, Clifford admitted he had worked for Union Pacific, but claimed he no longer remembered details because it was so long ago. The investigator produced the time cards. Clifford glanced at them, pushed them away, and said he didn't trust old paperwork to accurately reflect what really happened. This deliberate distancing repeated with every question about his work schedule and daily life. Next, they compared residency records with his statements. The investigator pointed out that Clifford left Casper during a time frame suspiciously aligned with Lena's disappearance. Clifford frowned, but only replied that he had changed jobs and simply didn't want to live in Casper anymore. When asked why he left without notice, he said, "I wasn't obligated to tell anyone where I was going." At that point, the investigators presented depot data: his presence in the depot that evening, the match between his job duties and the perpetrator profile, and the travel routes he could have used. Clifford listened without reaction, merely shaking his head whenever asked if he had been near the spot where Lena vanished. The interrogation shifted to behavioral characteristics of the perpetrator, especially handedness and smoking habit. The investigator asked directly, "Which is your dominant hand?" Clifford answered quickly, "Left." But when shown the description of the perpetrator's habit of smoking Lucky Strike, Clifford strongly denied it. "I didn't smoke that brand much. Everyone smoked Lucky Strike back then." "It doesn't mean anything." The investigator did not reply. He simply opened another file, the genealogical DNA file. Not the full results, not an absolute conclusion, but the scientific analysis showing that the DNA recovered from Lena's cloth bag belonged to the Hale lineage, and Clifford was the only person present in Casper, working at the depot, who matched every other behavioral characteristic. When the sheet with the family tree chart was placed in front of him, Clifford suddenly fell completely silent. He neither denied nor asked questions. He just stared at the chart for a long time, then slightly shrugged, as if the weight of decades was pressing down. The investigator continued, "Can you explain why DNA from Lena's cloth bag falls within the Hale lineage?" Clifford did not answer. He turned his face away and remained utterly silent. The silence lasted so long that the recording officer had to confirm whether he wished to continue answering or invoke his right to remain silent. Clifford only nodded slowly, formally refusing to say more. When Clifford's entire initial statement was compared against the case file, the team noted, he denied any involvement. He avoided answering questions that touched on specific actions. He could provide no alibi evidence for the day Lena disappeared. His responses contained contradictions when he tried to deny smoking habits and handedness. In the day's final report, the investigator clearly recorded, "The suspect's statement fails to refute any piece of the evidentiary chain." Clifford Hale exhibits a high level of denial, while simultaneously falling into multiple logical gaps, especially when confronted with the genealogical DNA. The confrontation ended without a confession, but the investigators did not need one to proceed. They already had an unbroken chain of facts, and Clifford, even in silence, had failed to break a single link. The next phase of the case would take them to an even more significant turning point, one that for decades, Lena's family and the entire Casper community had never dared hope for: recovering the remains missing for nearly a century. The heavy atmosphere lingering after the confrontation with Clifford Hale had barely begun to lift, when a piece of information from the cold case review team reached the investigation room. In a long-forgotten, the hunting party had once spotted several small bone fragments on the north slope of Muddy Mountain, but at the time no one connected them to Lena Hollister's disappearance. That detail suddenly became more significant than ever. because Muddy Mountain sat exactly on the departure axis from Casper that the team had mapped out based on Clifford's historical records. A forensic geology team was dispatched to the location described in the report. Decades of leaf litter, soil, rocks and tree roots had covered almost the entire original terrain, but one slightly depressed area showed unusual signs. Shallow depth probing tools were deployed, and within the first few hours the specialist recovered a small long bone size, consistent with a child aged 9. The discovery shifted the entire team into a full grid search. Every square was numbered, every handful of soil sifted through screen. More bone fragments appeared, tiny hand bones, several rib sections, then a small weathered skull fragment. Everything pointed to the skeleton of a child. Right beside the burial site, objects that once seemed meaningless suddenly became evidence. A rusted metal hair clip and a pale brown piece of fabric, woven in the exact style of 19. No one on the forensic team voiced their guess aloud, but the match with the description of the outfit Lena was wearing the day she vanished was unmistakable. The bones were collected using modern protocols and sent to the state lab. Though time had stripped away all soft tissue, DNA extraction from bone marrow allowed the lab to recover a partial genetic profile. The goal was not to hunt a perpetrator but to identify the victim. The sample was compared against DNA voluntarily provided by Hollister relatives when the case was reopened. Genetic analysis took weeks. Broken DNA segments were painstakingly stitched together using computational tools. That persistence finally paid off. The marrow profile matched perfectly with Lena's maternal relatives. Cross-analysis with the paternal line reinforced the conclusion with high confidence, confirming that the remains found on Muddy Mountain were indeed Lena Hollister. The confirmation reached headquarters in absolute silence. None of the people in that room had ever met Lena, yet everyone felt a lump in their throat. A disappearance that had lasted nearly 80 years, a case generations of investigators had believed would never be solved, had finally found its victim. The official announcement followed shortly afterward. Lena Hollister's body had been located and identified through familial DNA. In Casper, where the memory of her disappearance had once haunted the entire wartime community, the news hit like an earthquake. Old-timers recalled the dusty shoes running along the depot in 1947, the nights when no one dared leave their porch lights off, and the grief that was never spoken aloud. Younger generations, who had only heard the story secondhand, now watched it step out of the past with unimaginable weight. There was no doubt left. The final piece had fallen into place. Lena's body had returned to the light of justice, and the case was about to enter its decisive phase, where the full truth would have to face the court. The discovery of Lena Hollister's remains on the north slope of Muddy Mountain became the final milestone for prosecutors to formally bring Clifford Hale to trial. No longer a vague missing person case built mostly on behavioral inference. The prosecution now had everything needed for a jury: the victim's bones, familial DNA results, the suspect's travel history, 1947 physical evidence, and modern forensic analysis. It all formed a chain of evidence stretching nearly 8 decades. On the opening day, the courtroom was packed with press and Casper residents. Trying a nearly 90-year-old man for a 1947 cold case was unprecedented in Wyoming. Clifford was wheeled in, face calm but eyes constantly avoiding the prosecution table. The prosecutor opened by laying out the entire timeline of the case, exactly as it had unfolded over nearly 80 years. Brown fibers, Lucky Strike cigarette ash. Investigation focuses on the depot but lacks forensic tools. Case goes cold. 1970s re-examination of fibers and ash confirms the perpetrator had an occupational link to the deep. Early 21st century modern DNA technology extracts trace DNA from Lena's canvas bag. Genealogical DNA narrows suspects to the Hale family. Reconstruction of Clifford's travel timeline confirms his presence in Casper during the exact window of the disappearance. Finally, recovery of remains at Muddy Mountain, familial DNA match with the Hollister family. The prosecutor did not need to over-explain individual pieces. The strength lay in the seamless continuity. Every link pointed to one man, Clifford Hale. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars: 1947 crime scene forensics, brown fibers from a rail yard worker's uniform, work boot prints, Lucky Strike ash, all matched Clifford's job and smoking habit at the time. Travel timeline: Clifford was at the depot during the precise hours. Lena vanished. left Casper immediately afterward, and followed a travel pattern consistent with the route the killer likely used. Genealogical DNA. DNA extracted from Lena's bag belonged to the Hale lineage. Of all Hale family members living in Wyoming in 1947, only Clifford matched every behavioral, geographic, occupational, and travel criteria. The prosecutor emphasized, no single factor alone convicts Clifford Hale, but together they form an unbreakable chain, and that chain fits only one man perfectly. Clifford's defense attorney, handed an almost impossible case, countered on two main fronts. First, they argued that genealogical DNA is not a full genetic profile, but inferred lineage, attempting to convince the jury that thousands of distant Hale relatives could theoretically match the sample. Second, they attacked the passage of time, questioning whether any memory statement or document from 1947 could still be reliable. They called it a case built on historical ambiguity, trying to plant doubt that even a mountain of old evidence could be distorted by decades. Yet they offered no plausible alternative suspect who satisfied the same chain of conditions. Throughout the trial, Clifford never denied being right-handed, never disputed his work schedule, and offered no reasonable explanation for his sudden departure from Casper. His lawyer could only repeat the argument about time. After 2 weeks, the jury retired to deliberate. They reviewed every chart, map, file, historical exhibit, and expert testimony on forensics and genealogy. Deliberations lasted many hours, but saw little disagreement. Most jurors agreed that time could not erase the overwhelming convergence of evidence. The verdict was read in a courtroom so quiet it felt empty. Clifford Hale guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Lena Hollister. Despite his advanced age, Clifford was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, in accordance with current law for the most serious offense. He remained expressionless, said nothing, stared at the floor, and lightly gripped the arms of his wheelchair. The prosecution did not celebrate. They simply noted that justice had arrived late, but it had arrived. For many in the courtroom, this was not just a conviction, it was the completion of a journey that had lasted nearly a century. With this verdict, the Lena Hollister case was officially closed in the eyes of the law, ready to move into its final chapter, the community's aftermath, and the legacy of a cold case, solved after almost 80 years. The court's verdict ended the legal journey, but for investigators and forensic experts, the Lena Hollister case was more than just a successfully prosecuted crime. It left a bigger question. Why did a seemingly straightforward disappearance of a little girl near a rail yard take nearly 8 decades to solve? The answer lies at the intersection of the limitations of the era, early investigative bottlenecks, and the revolutionary advances in criminal science. In 1947, Wyoming authorities had only direct observation, witness statements, and physical items to work with. No DNA analysis, no microscopic comparison of footwear, fabric or tobacco residue. Moreover, the abduction happened quickly in a large, chaotic rail yard, making trace evidence nearly impossible to secure. The perpetrator also left no impulsive mistakes, no ransom demands, no taunting letters, no false identities, no bragging. All that remained were tiny dropped crumbs, too few to form a picture at the time. Investigators of that era faced 3 clear obstacles. First, forensic technology limitations. Brown fibers, cigarette ash, boot prints were collected, but could not be deeply analyzed. Modern polarized light microscopy, or material analysis, would have revealed connections decades earlier. Second, no centralized federal data storage or cross-referencing. DNA did not yet exist in practice. Vehicle and residency records were scattered, making it nearly impossible to track Clifford after he left Casper. Third, behavioral profiling did not exist. Building a suspect profile from handedness, occupation or smoking habits only became standard years later. In 1947, those clues were treated as isolated data points. All of this pushed the case into stagnation, turning it into one of Wyoming's longest-running cold cases. 3 scientific leaps eventually opened a door previous generations could not reach. Just a few remaining cells on the bag's seam were enough for modern technology to recover a partial genetic profile. Genealogical DNA. Instead of hunting the perpetrator directly, experts traced relatives of the DNA owner. That method led straight to the Hale family, something traditional investigation could never have uncovered. Timeline reconstruction using digitized archives. With digitized payrolls, rental records and vehicle registrations, investigators could finally map Clifford's movements across counties and state. Only when these three elements converged did the chain of evidence become seamless and strong enough to bring the case back to justice. The Lena Hollister case has become an iconic case study in American investigation because it proves a crime buried for nearly a century can still be solved with next-generation forensics. Genealogical DNA can crack decades-old cases even when no body was originally recovered. Seemingly worthless old evidence, faded canvas bags, rotted fibers, can still contain identifying traces. Federal record-keeping and digitization directly affect long-term solvability. Most importantly, the case reminds investigators that time does not erase truth. It only makes it harder to find. Cold cases across the United States have since been re-examined with renewed hope. If Lena could be found after 70 years, other families may yet receive the answers they have waited a lifetime for. With this professional conclusion, the Lena Hollister file is closed, not merely as a solved crime, but as proof of the power of modern investigative science, and of the perseverance of people who refuse to let the truth stay buried forever. Although the Lena Hollister case began in 1947, this story spanning nearly 8 decades still holds deep meaning for modern American life. First, it shows how the silence of an era can turn one child's tragedy into a community-wide mystery. Lena vanished just steps from a familiar tavern to the depot, a space the town of Casper thought was too familiar to be dangerous. This mirrors today's reality, places we consider safe because they're familiar, the bus stop near home, the small neighborhood, the usual parking lot can still harbor risk if adults let their guard down. The case also underscores the importance of record-keeping and community responsibility. Items that seemed meaningless, an old canvas bag, brown fibers, Lucky Strike ash, only gained value because they were carefully preserved, teaching modern Americans that even small, seemingly unimportant information can save a life. That is why today's community should support law enforcement by promptly reporting anything unusual instead of assuming it's probably nothing. Another key detail is that Clara left Casper abruptly and no one asked questions. In an increasingly mobile and connected society like today's United States, a sudden disappearance or behavioral change in a neighbor, coworker, or tenant is sometimes a signal worth noticing, not to suspect without cause, but to recognize that strong communities watch out for one another with a sense of duty. Finally, the Lena Hollister case reminds us that justice can arrive very late, yet it never loses its value. Thanks to modern forensics and genealogical DNA, an 80-year-old mystery has been resolved. This inspires Americans today that the pursuit of truth, whether in a criminal case, a relationship, or a personal crisis, is always worth seeing through to the end. Thank you for following to the end of this journey through one of America's oldest cold cases. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep exploring together. See you in the next video, where we'll open more files that seem to have slept peacefully for decades.